begin. So I hope that everybody is well. We're going to speak this evening about how do we invite God into our lives. You see, this chapter 6, speaks about the concept of holiness, which we dealt with last week, and we came to understand that the definition of holiness is not some airy-fairy spiritual kind of a concept, and the concept of holiness is definitely not the same as we learned last week. It's not the same as the concept of spirituality, nor, for that matter, is it the same as the concept of religious, whatever you want to call it, observance, fromness. The reality is that holiness, we learned last week, is anything that allows Hashem to occupy the space. That's really what holiness is. What makes a Torah scroll holy? The fact that the Torah scroll has no other purpose whatsoever except the purpose that Hashem intends for it. Doesn't have its own opinion, doesn't have ulterior motives, doesn't have alternatives. Hashem wants it to be a Torah scroll. And Hashem wants it to convey His wisdom to the world. That's what it does. Without hesitation, without hiccup, without anything that may interfere with its purpose. That's the definition of holy. And once we have that definition, of course, now we can ask ourselves a very important question, which is, how do we become holy? How do we invite Hashem into our lives? The two go together, right? In order for there to be holiness, Hashem has to be present. How do we make Hashem present in our lives? Okay, so that's the issue that we're going to focus on this evening, or at least begin to focus on this evening. And effectively, we're going to talk about things that are in a state of holiness, or beings that are in a state of holiness, or people who are in a state of holiness. So we spoke a little bit about this last week. What makes Moshe holy? What makes Yom Kippur holy? What makes a Torah scroll holy? We spoke a little bit about it, and this evening we're going to continue along the same theme. Okay, so that's what we're going to speak about, is the concept of how we become holy, because that speaks directly to the principle of how do we invite Hashem into our lives. Okay, that's what we're going to have a look at, and I'm just going to scroll down because it's a little bit further than where we are, what's on the screen right now. Okay, so let's go back a step just to create context again. So if you have a look at the page that we're looking at right now on the screen, go about halfway down the page, in the middle of the line. So the first word on the line is the word acher, and we're in the middle of that line, even though we started to read this already last week. V'tzad hakedusha. Okay, that's what we began. That's actually where we spent our entire conversation last week, defining v'tzad hakedusha. What is the realm of holiness? What is the side of holiness? What is considered to be holy? What determines that something is holy? So we said v'tzad hakedusha. The reality of holiness, Einoi, is nothing ella, nothing else but. Okay, and that's very often what you find in Torah language, is when we want to say that something is exclusively a particular way, we'll say Einoi ella, it is nothing else but. So tzaddik kedusha, it's not open to negotiation. We don't get to choose. We don't get to decide what is or isn't holy. Einoi ella, there is no alternative to holiness besides this. What we're about to define, that is holy. Anything else is not holy. Might be very nice, might be attractive, might even be spiritual, but it's not holy. Okay? So that's our focus at this particular point in time. Okay? What is holy? So v'tzad kedusha, the side of holiness, einoi elo, it is nothing else but hashra'ah. Hashra'ah means the resting, vehamshacha, and the drawing down, mikedushasoi shel hakadosh baruch hu, from Hashem's holiness. Okay, that is the definition. The only valid definition of holiness is something that welcomes Hashem into the space. That's the only valid definition of holiness. I'm sure many people have their own definitions, and they will argue in favor of their own definition. It's irrelevant to us. There's only one valid definition of holiness. What invites Hashem into the space? Hashra'ah vehamshacha mikdushasai shel hakadosh baruch hu. Where Hashem is allowed to rest, where Hashem is allowed to manifest, where Hashem is allowed to enter the space, that equals holiness. The question is, how? How do you invite Hashem in? What exactly are we supposed to do? Now, it's quite important, and everything, of course, is hashgacha pratis, everything is divine providence. It's quite important to know this information. It's additionally important to know this information as we approach Rosh Hashanah. Because many people will tell you, of course, that Rosh Hashanah is a day of judgment, which it is. And they'll describe that Rosh Hashanah is the time that Hashem decides everything that's going to happen to us for the coming year, both materially and in a certain sense spiritually. And that's also true. But what people don't often speak about is that the core focus of Rosh Hashanah is for us to invite Hashem into our space. We're not supposed to be beggars on the dole. We're not supposed to be nudniks, nagging Hashem for things that we want. Please, please, please. Because that's, I think, how some people do it, right? Please, Hashem, I really need this and I really need that. The truth of the matter is, it's a shtickle chutzpah, if you think about it, for a person to stand there and say, God, I need and I want X and Y. On what basis, Who are we and who gave us the rights? Actually, the focus of Rosh Hashanah is to invite Hashem into our space, to generate an environment of holiness in our lives. That's a huge focal point of what Rosh Hashanah is. And in the language of Rosh Hashanah, we achieve that by accepting Hashem's authority, by so-called crowning Hashem as the king. But we need to understand what that actually means. Crowning Hashem as the king sounds very abstract, maybe a little bit poetic, and not necessarily practical. So what does it actually mean? How do we manifest godliness in our space? We don't surely have the power, the ability, the know-how to be able to do this. Hashem will not manifest elo al dover shebotel etzlo yisborach, unless it is an item, a place, a person, or a time that is botel to Hashem. Now, we've got to understand what this word botel means. And it's probably fair to say that this is one of the major terms that you have to be familiar with if you're going to learn Chabad Hasidus, is this concept of botel, which is the verb, or bitul, the process. So other way around. Botel is the adjective, bitul is the verb. In other words, there's a process, there's a shift, a foundational shift that we have to undergo, and especially, as I say, headed towards Rosh Hashanah, in order to invite Hashem into our space. Now, the first most logical thing to acknowledge is we don't get to determine how Hashem enters our space. We're finite beings with very finite understanding and insight. So it would be really far-fetched to imagine that we could dictate to Hashem how Hashem should enter our space. Doesn't really make sense. So that's logical. It's logical to accept that it's got to be on His terms, which is great. You know what the strange things about people? We are experts at applying our bias to what we believe are Hashem's terms. We're brilliant at that. So, for example, you'll get one person who happens to be humanitarian by nature, and they'll say, how do you invite Hashem into your life? Through humanitarian acts. And you'll have another person who is very much into the nuance of halacha, of the minutiae of Jewish law, and they'll say, how do you invite Hashem into your life? Through strict adherence to halacha. Put the two people in a room, and they'll both scream at each other that I've got the way to God and you're wrong. So we're incredibly skilled, without even realizing it, subconsciously at reinterpreting what Hashem wants to suit our bias. That's why this term that we're learning right now, this term botel or bitul, is such a powerful term. Let's try and understand it. Let's first understand what the term means. Once we understand what the term means, then we'll understand how it applies to this particular conversation. And then we'll realize what a massive challenge it is to actually invite Hashem into our space. It's not impossible. I'm not saying that, God forbid, but it's a huge challenge. What is bittul? Okay, let's explore it. By the way, I'd like to point out that the Hebrew word ha-bittul, which is the definite article of bittul of this complete, what we're about to discover is called surrender or submission. It's actually the same letters as the word tvilah, which is immersion in a mikveh. So think of it that way. When a person wants to immerse in a mikveh in order to purify themselves, in order to immerse and in order to come out on the other side pure, their entire body has to go under the water. So halachically, if even one hair doesn't go under the water, the person is not purified through the mikveh. That's insightful because that tells us that this is an immersive experience. The concept of bittul, as we're going to explain, it's got to be a complete experience of bittul. It can't be half-baked, can't be half-hearted. It's got to be real. Okay, so what's bittul? Let's talk about it. What is bittul? Well, the easiest place to learn about bittul is actually in the laws of keeping kosher, because that's the most common place where we encounter it. Just be aware that what we're going to discuss over here, it might have one application in halachic terms with the laws of kashrus, and it might have a slightly different manifestation in the process, the spiritual process of becoming a holy individual or inviting Hashem into our lives, but the principles will be the same. So let's talk about bittul. Bittul in the kitchen, right? That's a very big area where bittul is a big deal. Works as follows. What happens if you are busy cooking right now? Hope I don't give anybody sleepless nights from this. But what happens if right now you happen to be cooking a massive stew on top of the stove? You've got a big pot filled with a lamb stew, and it's cooking on the stove right now. What's the nightmare? Here's the nightmare. You come to the Tanya shir, and you're distracted from what's going on in the kitchen, and the next thing you hear, this blood-curdling scream, which basically sounds like, Oy vey! Okay, so what happened? What happened? You mute yourself. What happened? What happened? Oy vey. I was in the middle of pouring some milk into my coffee, and I slipped, and the milk carton went flying across the room, and it spilt into the lamb stew. Now what? There's now this household kosher kitchen emergency. You got to call like a hotline, Trafe Busters. Who are you going to call? They're going to come. So what do? You got the stew. You got people coming over. It's an emergency. There's milk in the lamb stew. What do you do? Well, because it's milk, as opposed to, let's say, a chunk of cheese. If it was a chunk of cheese, you could look around inside, find it, pull it out, It's milk. Before you even know what's happened, it's completely dissipated into the stew, and there's no way to get the milk out. Now you've got meat and dairy that have mixed. That is treif. So what's the law? The halacha. The halacha is we apply a principle called bittul. How much stew versus how much milk? And we use a simple formula. If we can safely assume that there's 60 times more volume of the lamb stew than there is of the drops of milk that went into the stew, then the milk is of no consequence. Okay? It's very interesting, by the way, because the foundational principle of the laws of kashrus is you only know that a kosher problem has occurred if you can taste the problem. Okay? In other words, the thinking is very simple. The thinking is we eat to enjoy. I know everybody tells you they eat to live and they eat to be healthy and whatever. Yeah, right. We still eat to enjoy. So the foundational principle of the laws of kashrus is that if I can't taste the additive that is no good, then I can ignore it if it is small enough to ignore. Okay? So our assumption is if it's 60 times more of the meat than it is of the drops of milk, you won't be able to know that it's there. You won't be able to taste it. It is botel. It is completely neutralized. It's as if it doesn't exist. That's, of course, why the example was about a liquid. If it was a chunk of cheese, you can't pretend it doesn't exist. There's still a chunk of cheese in there that you'd be able to see with the naked eye. So all the theory in the world's not going to make it disappear. But here, when you're talking about a liquid that completely dissolves into the stew, then we say if there's enough stew to neutralize the dairy, it is batel. It does not exist halachically. What does the word batel mean? To totally cease to exist. That's what batel or bitul means. Bitul is the process. Batel is once you've achieved the process. Ceases to exist. Now, in the case of the milk that fell into the pot of stew, the milk was batel to the stew. In other words, there's an overwhelming amount of lamb stew. Since there's an overwhelming amount, that's what overrides the unique identity of the milk, and the milk disappears. You can't be batel without something to be batel to. You can't be overwhelmed unless there's something to be overwhelmed by. Here's another example. Very different example. Let's say, now this is where things get really interesting. Let's say that you decided that you were going to watch the World Cup soccer final, which, by the way, not so sure that it's a place for Jewish people this time around. I don't know, you can debate that. But let's say that you were going to watch the soccer World Cup final. I don't know how many people are going to be in the stadium. Let's say it's 100,000 people in the stadium. Yes? 100,000 people in the stadium. Where you're sitting in the stadium, you obviously know that you exist. But for the soccer players on the field, you are batel to the crowd. They have no clue that you're there. They know there's a crowd, but they are absolutely unaware of the fact that you schlepped all the way halfway across the world to go and watch them play soccer, and you're their biggest fan, and you would want their autograph on a soccer ball, and all these wonderful things, and they don't know that you exist. Batel. You're batel to the crowd. But that could change. You know how that could change? Because the camera might pan across the crowd and catch you on camera. And the next thing, out of 100,000 people in the stadium, your face is the one that's on the screen. And then you realize, actually, I'm not batel. I just felt batel. I felt like I was, so to speak, insignificant. I felt like I lost my identity. But hey, look, there's my identity. It's back. It's on the big screen. Everybody's cheering because they're seeing me on the screen. Whereas if at exactly that same moment that my picture was generated onto the screen in front of 100,000 fans at the Soccer World Cup final, if at the exact same moment the International Space Station happened to pass over that same stadium, would they know that I'm on the screen? Would they know that I'm in the crowd? Would they know that there is a crowd? Would they even know that there's a stadium down there? From that perspective, when you're looking at the world from a distance, everything that lives on the world is completely batel. Totally loses its identity. Now, the reason I'm using these different illustrations is because it's important for us to know that if we are going to talk about this concept of bitul, this concept of neutralizing an entity or surrendering our ego, as we're going to see, we have to acknowledge that it could happen at different levels and to different extents. And as we learn more Hasidus, so we start to nuance the different kinds of bitul that are possible. Here, at this point in Tanya, we're only going to look at two possibilities, both of which are relevant to our conversation. So, Hashem will not manifest in an environment unless that environment is willing to relinquish self. Batel etzlo yusbarach. Unless that environment or that individual is willing to let go of everything that they believe defines them, Hashem's not coming in. This is fascinating because this basically tells us that we will never find Hashem if we're obsessed with us finding Hashem. How's that for a thought? Because if I am obsessed, if I have a need, I need God in my life, and many people say this, I need God in my life, then I've put I as a barrier between myself and God. Where is Hashem manifest? Ein HaKadosh Baruch Hu shoire ela. The only environment in which Hashem will be manifest is Dover Shebotel Etzla Yisbarech, something that lets go of the I in Hashem's context. That doesn't mean the person becomes a doormat. That doesn't mean that the person loses a sense of their value. It doesn't mean that a person has no idea of what they can contribute to the world. It means that in the context of being in Hashem's presence, I melt away completely. Now, the reality is that would actually happen to us if, theoretically, if we were in a position that we could actually see Hashem, needless to say, we would be bottled completely in a flash. And not only that, it even happens to us when we engage with people who for us are very powerful or very important people. So let's say that there's an individual who your whole life you've idolized, and you really, all you wish is that one day you could meet this particular individual. And years and years and years go by, and then boom, there it is. You get the opportunity and you meet this person who is your childhood idol or your adult life idol or whatever it is, the person you look up to more than any other person in the world. And in your head, you've replayed this scenario 100,000 times, exactly how you're going to behave, what you're going to say, how you're going to get their autograph. And you get there and you don't know what to say. Not only that, you actually lose all sense of yourself. All sense of what you wanted, what you had in mind, what you planned, all the scenarios, you just completely dissolve because the presence of the person is so powerful in your life that it overwhelms your own presence. That's bittul. Like the milk that goes into the lamb stew, there's so much lamb stew, the milk just disappears. There's so much of the other person's greatness and presence and awesomeness that I just disappear. I couldn't even think of talking about me in that context. Multiply that exponentially if we could see Hashem and be in His presence. We'd completely disappear. And it happened once in history. It happened at the time of the giving of the Torah, which was the single time in history that Hashem revealed Himself without limitation to a group of people. And the Gemara tells us that, you know what happened? Al kol dibur v'dibur porcho nishmoson. Hashem says the words, Anoichi Hashem Elokecha, I am Hashem your God, and everybody's souls fly out of their bodies. And the Gemara tells us that the bodies themselves get flung back a distance of 12 kilometers, but that's not even so important for us. The important thing is that the souls get blown out of the bodies. What happens to a body when it no longer has a soul? Botel. It's neutralized. It can't walk, talk, breathe, move, think. It's done. It disappears. It's completely dysfunctional or non-functional. So there's a great illustration of the experience of bittul when we're exposed to godliness. And by the way, the Rambam tells us that that's often what would happen to prophets. So the prophet would be exposed to prophecy and would completely overwhelm them, and they would collapse, and they'd have fits, or they would fall asleep, or they would lose control of their body, because in the face of such exposure, the response is bittul. I just disappear. Now, we're not talking necessarily about such dramatic states of bittul, but the principle is, Ein HaKadosh Baruch Hu Shoira, Hashem is never going to be present in a space until that space, that being, that person, that time is willing to let go of self. Now, there's two ways that could happen. Bein befoyal. One way that it happens is where the the bittul is real. It's active. And an example of that, bein befoyal mamish, when it's practically a state of bittul, would be kem malachim elyonim, like the highest of the angels. We know that there are various hierarchies of angels. There are different kinds. The Rambam speaks about 10 different classes of angels. So malachim elyonim are the highest of all of those angels. And for them, the sense of bittul, of absolute submission and surrender to God, is palpable every moment of their existence. Those angels, at least one group of those angels, we call seraphim, right? You heard of the seraphim? They appear in our davening and they appear at the Pesach Seder, right? Not through an angel and not through a seraph. And I don't think anybody really at their Pesach Seder pauses to say, hey, what's a seraph? Because, at that point you're so close to the meal, let's just get there, Seraphim, as we say in our davening, every single day before we say the Shema, we talk about the Seraphim and how they pronounce Kadosh, 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 how God is holy and holy and holy, as described to us by the prophet Yeshaya, who saw this. He saw this happen with his own eyes. What are these Seraphim? So confusing when we talk about angels, because for us, angels are these Renaissance-style artworks. That's what angels are. They got like halos and wings, and they all look like little children. What is an angel? An angel is a burst of energy, of spiritual energy, that has a particular spiritual form, has absolutely no physical form, has a spiritual form and a spiritual definition. And what distinguishes one angel from the next is that each one has a different definition. So to put that differently, what distinguishes the code that runs WhatsApp from the code that runs Facebook? Physically, you can't. Of course, the icon is different. When you enter the app, it looks different. But the code, it's just a different string of symbols. That's what distinguishes one code from the other. So that's what distinguishes one angel from the other. These angels called seraphim, the word seraphim means to burn, to combust. Spontaneous combustion. It's one of those paranormal experiences that people debate whether or not it exists, right? These beings spontaneously combust. That's why they're called seraphim. They don't live here on earth, so there's no, self-immolation going on. They're beings of fire. They're beings who are constantly in a state of combustion. Seraphim. Now, the prophet Yeshaya tells us about these seraphim when he describes how things look in heaven, whatever that means. It's all obviously metaphoric. And he describes how there's the so-called spiritual throne of God. And he says, Seraphim oimdim mima'al loi. The seraphim stand above the holy throne of Hashem. And the Kabbalists ask, how's that even possible? The throne of Hashem, how can a created being stand higher than Hashem's throne? It doesn't make any sense. And the Kabbalists explain that there's this notion that where you aspire to be, you are already at some level. So, for example, if a person is in the Tanya Shir, but straight after the Tanya Shir, they have something that is at least equally, if not more exciting, and they spend the whole time in the Tanya Shir thinking, okay, what time? What time are we going till? Because I've got this other thing to be at. Then in a certain sense, that's actually where they are. They're not really in the Tanya Shir. They're actually there. I'm sure that this is completely hypothetical, but perhaps could you imagine, this is quite a far-fetched scenario, but could you imagine a Jewish person in shul thinking about when they'll already be at the Kiddush after shul? Can you imagine such a thought? Right? So what does that? That means that the person's already there. They're already after shul. That's why, by the way, when you start Yom Kippur, you say the second line of the Shema, Baruch Shem, aloud. And we're told that one of the reasons we say it aloud is because the rest of the year we're not at the level of angels, and it's part of the angels' prayer, so you say it silently. But in Yom Kippur we're at a level like angels, so we get to say it aloud. So the beginning of Yom Kippur, we say it aloud. At Ma'ariv, after Yom Kippur has concluded, but we haven't yet broken the fast, we say it softly. So they ask the question, the whole reason you're allowed to say it aloud is because you're like an angel. Let's be honest. By the time Kol Nidre rolls around, we're all rolling around. We don't look like angels. We're stuffed to the brim. We can't breathe. We've eaten so much. That's like an angel. That's when you say Baruch Shem aloud. And at the end of Yom Kippur, when you're saying Ma'ariv at the end of Yom Kippur, and you've now fasted for 25 and a bit hours, as the tradition is, now you're much more angelic, and you have to say the Baruch Shem silently. And the answer is, at Kol Nidre, your head is in the whole of Yom Kippur that's still to come. And at Ma'ariv, your head is at the buffet. So that determines if you're an angel or not. Seraphim oindim ima loi means that these are beings whose entire entity, their entire reality is an aspiration to reach a level of connection to Hashem that is even higher than the level represented by the divine throne. That's where they're aiming. That's what they care about. That's what they aspire towards. And they know full well that if they get anywhere near there, they'll completely combust. They'll be totally overwhelmed by the intensity of godliness. They will absolutely lose their identity, and they're fine with that. That's called bittul. They have nothing that they're clutching, nothing they need to hold on to. No security blankets, no plans for tomorrow that might be wrecked if I get too close to God. No, what's in it for me? Oh, if I get close to God, maybe He'll give me a nice portion in the world to come. None of that. They have bittul, bepoyel, mamish. They literally live with an absolute surrender to Hashem. It's all about what Hashem wants. Hashem wants us to cleave to Him, so we'll climb as high as we can. And by the way, that's also a reason why they're compared to fire, because fire is constantly rising. Even though theoretically, if the fire would successfully rise off the fuel, it would die. And that's how the Seraphim are. Therefore, they are holy. They say, Kadosh, Kadosh, Kadosh. They can acknowledge and they can experience divine holiness. Why? Because they're completely transparent. Because they have nothing of their own. There's no obstruction. There's no clinging to self. They completely surrender to God. Bittul, they're overwhelmed by Hashem's reality. Therefore, they're the perfect setting for holiness. So Malachim Elyonim, the higher kinds of angels, they live with a pragmatic, realistic, tangible experience of bittul, and therefore they're absolutely holy. That's why we include them in our davening, because we also want to have something like that where we have this incredible holiness. But for us, bein bekoyach, for us, the ability to have bittul is something we have within ourselves in potential form, but not yet expressed. Kachol ish Yisrael lemato. That's the reality of every single Jewish person living here on earth in the human form, and yet shebekoichoi liosbotel mamesh legabe HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Yet every one of us has the potential, the capacity to be completely neutralized and surrender ourselves totally to Hashem. B'mesirus nafshoi al kedushas Hashem, and the way we do this is through the process called Mesiras Nefesh. Now, we may never have the experience or the need for Mesiras Nefesh ever in our lives, but the fact that we have the potential counts for something. So what is Mesiras Nefesh? The most literal understanding of the term Mesiras Nefesh is personal sacrifice for Hashem's sake. So it's the classical example of the cross or the sword, and we say we'll take the sword. Mesiras Nefesh. Where if somebody, God forbid, threatens a Jew's connection to their Judaism, they say, you're going to have to kill me first. That's bittul. Right? That's bittul. That's the ability for a person to completely surrender themselves, their future, their dreams, their aspirations, their assets, their family, and say, you'll have to take me first. I'm not willing to relinquish my connection to God. So it's there b'koyach, it's there within every single one of us. Look at Jewish history, and unfortunately, we have had more than enough occasion to prove that this is our headspace. That Jews under the most incredibly brutal circumstances, stick to Judaism at all costs, at the cost to their own life, knowing that that's what Hashem wants. But there's another layer of Mesiras Nefesh as well. And this is where it gets deeper and more profound. So let's look at an example. Could you think of somebody who experienced Mesiras Nefesh, sacrifice for God, in our Torah? You think of somebody? I'm sure you could probably think of more than one person. For example, we had Daniel, who lands up in the lion's den. Okay, perhaps it wasn't because he was defending Hashem's honor necessarily, but his colleagues, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, who very clearly were thrown into a furnace because they wouldn't bow to an idol, that was absolute Mesiras Nefesh. And that reminds us of Avraham Avinu, Avraham, our forefather. He was also thrown into a furnace because he had absolute dedication to Hashem. And Nimrod, the king at the time, said, "You either bow to me or into the furnace." And Avraham said, "Throw me in the furnace." First person ever in history to do so. That is sacrifice for God, yes. But it's not the ultimate expression of Mesiras Nefesh, being willing to relinquish the soul. Let's fast forward. What happens much later on in Abraham's life is, at this point, Abraham eventually is blessed with a child. He's had many, many trials and tribulations in his life, many tests by Hashem, as the Mishnah tells us in the Ethics of the Fathers, in the 5th chapter of Pirkei Avos, that Hashem tested Abraham 10 times. He's been through a lot. And then Hashem comes to him and says, Kach no es bincha, we're going to read this on Rosh Hashanah. Please take your son, es yechidcha, the son that is unique for you, asher ahavta, the son who you love most, es Yitzchak, your son Yitzchak. That's the son that Avraham never thought he was going to have. And take him up onto a mountain and bring him as an offering to me. Now, it's one thing to expect that a person is going to give up their own life for their beliefs. It's something altogether different to expect that somebody's going to give up their child's life for their beliefs. Especially when you consider who this is. This is Avraham, who campaigned with every fiber of his being against the pagan practices of that time. And what was the common pagan practice at that time? Child sacrifice. This is an individual now who is well over 100 years old. That means for almost 100 years, he's fought the cause against exactly what Hashem has just asked him to do. And it's not like it will be some major publicity stunt to promote monotheism, because it's only going to be him and his son on top of the mountain. Nobody's going to see his dedication. Nobody's going to see his sacrifice. Nobody's going to be able to go tell his other adherents, wow, look at Avraham. They're just going to know that Avraham went up a mountain with his son and the son never came back. And there'll be speculation in the community for the rest of time. And all the kibbutzes at the Kiddush on Shabbos will be saying, what do you think happened? Not only that, for close on 100 years, Avraham had a singular mission. Vayikra Shom B'Shem Hashem Keil Olam, to announce and educate God, to announce God and educate the world about God. Singular focus. And the Torah tells us very clearly that that Avraham gave everything to Yitzchak. That wasn't just in his will, you get all the camels and the tents. He gave everything that would take his monotheistic tradition to the next generation. Everything was given to Yitzchak. Everything was invested in Yitzchak. 37 years of investment in Yitzchak. Teaching, encouraging, explaining, connecting, meditating, whatever he did. And now Hashem says, go ahead and shecht him. Now I know what everybody thinks. Everybody thinks that if Abraham would go and shecht his son Yitzchak, then Hashem would make another miracle for him. And just like he had a child at the age of 99, he'd end up having a child at the age of 138, and he'd have and he'd educate that child, and everything would be fine. And everybody thinks that because he would listen to God, obviously if you listen to God, you're not going to get charged with murder, so he's okay. He'll still go to Gan Eden and everything will be fine. And the truth is, that's not the reality of the story. The reality of the story was that Hashem challenged Abraham to take everything that he had built up and destroy it. And there would be no further miracle. And there wouldn't even be immunity from murder. And there wouldn't even be a guarantee of a portion in the world to come. This was going to be true Mesirus Nefesh. Not only the sacrifice of physical life, literally the sacrifice of his soul's life. Now we read this story every single day. Besides the fact that we read it in Shul on Rosh Hashanah, on the second day of Rosh Hashanah, it's part of our preamble to the davening every single day. And you know why we read it every single day? To remind ourselves of this line. Bein bekoyach, it is the potential, kechol ish Yisrael lemato, that is within every single one of us here on earth. Every one of us. Shebekoychoi is botel mamish legabe HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That every one of us is capable of complete surrender to Hashem. Botel mamish, complete surrender. Not the surrender, not the bittul of I'm sitting in a crowd of 100,000 people. 99,000 of them don't even know that I exist, but I know I exist. Not the bittul of sitting in the stadium and the people from the International Space Station don't know that I or even the stadium exist, but I know that I exist. It's the bittul of standing face to face with God and recognizing I actually don't exist. Only Hashem exists. Therefore, only what Hashem says is of any value. And therefore, the only thing I would ever do is what Hashem tells me to do without any conception of, is it to my benefit? Will it have spiritual fallout? Is it problematic? And every one of us houses within ourselves that potential. That is why we are called a holy people. Because holiness is defined as the ability to allow Hashem into the space. And the way we allow Hashem into a space is by the space totally losing itself, so that there's nothing that sticks out on the ground or sticks out from the walls, so that the space can accommodate Hashem, so to speak, fully. How do we invite Hashem into our lives? Every time that we're willing to let go of what we would like to do and instead do what Hashem expects us to do. So it might not be so radical as Abraham taking his son up onto a mountain, but every time that we are willing to relinquish our own interests and instead adopt Hashem's interests, that's when we invite Hashem into our lives. That's how we become holy. That's what Judaism teaches. So it's an incredibly powerful principle. It's something that we'd have to revisit numerous times, as we will through the course of learning Tanya, the concept of bittul, because it's such a big and possibly overwhelming concept. But it's a total mind shift. And it helps us to appreciate that the only way Hashem enters our lives is when we're willing to let go of our stuff in favor of his interests. Okay, we'll continue with that, please God, next week.